name is Eva Klemencic. I'm from Educational Research Institute from Slovenia, so quite close to Italy. And thank you, Rolf, for your introduction to RED study, because now I no need to describe it in advance, because I'm also using the results from RED study, some variables from international options, but I'm focusing today mostly on the results on our national options, which were added to international questionnaires. So I know that in my title, I tried to do something that could be relevant or at least informative enough to Italian context, but there is a problem because Italy was not part in the RED study. Slovenia doesn't have the data, the rich data that you have from Invalsi, the longitudinal data. So I do totally agree that we should compare within the countries because we share at least similar cultural, economical, political, and other environments. But at the moment, actually, we don't have those data to compare. Neither prior to that, because as you see in the previous presentation, Rolf said Italy was part in ICIS study in 2018 and TIM study in 2019. Those were in the last 20 years, 30 years almost. The only two studies that Slovenia was not part of it, we didn't participate, so we don't have such, let's say, rich data prior to the epidemic that you have. But we have that data, so let's focus on that. The last study actually that we share, and from which we can say, parallel the context, is actually ICCS study, International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, in which both countries were participating in. It is also for 8th graders, teachers, and principals. Italy is also now participating in the next cycle. I mean, in the future, I think we will have enough data to compare, also pearls, next teams, and so on. But as I said, at the moment, we are stuck with the data that we have, especially from the Slovenian part of the view. So speaking about ICCS data, Civic and Citizenship Education Study, it is true that there was statistically significant difference in overall civic knowledge scale, civic knowledge results between Italy and Slovenia, but however, some background factors were associated, some of them even in the same way. This is especially true when we were comparing the results of Slovenia and Italy based on the language spoken at home, how this is associated with civic knowledge, and SES variables. So I think that speaking from the Slovenian perspective, maybe we will share something and it can be informative enough to Italian context. Anyway. I will speak briefly about school closures in Slovenia. Slovenia is also one of the countries that in Europe has quite a long periods in total, in 2020, in 2021, when the schools were actually closed. As we saw, we share this with our Italian colleagues. I will speak a little bit about some results from REDS, especially about grades, about assessing student knowledge and grading student knowledge. I know that this is not the main focus of schooling, of course it is learning, but because we have some historical problems, historical challenges with assessing and grading student knowledge, and this is why I decided to put several items, additional items, national items in the REDS questionnaires, because we were really interested. Because, as I said, from the historical perspective, we know that from 90s on, the grades, I mean, we are a really nice example of grade inflation, especially in compulsory education. Grades are increasing every single year. We have already national data, and what we found out is that during the COVID, when the schools were closed, the grades increased as much as they were increasing in the last 10 years. So we compensate previous 10 years in 1 year during the COVID. So this is why I was especially interested in this perspective too. And prior, but especially during the COVID, it was really, really high on the agenda. Different perspectives, different hearings from parents, from experts, from almost media were raised that we should not assess the student knowledge, we should not grade the student knowledge when we are doing remote schooling and so on. But at the end of the day, at the end of the school year, you need to give some feedback. So we did it slightly differently than normally, but here in my analysis I was really, I was interested in the perception of students and teachers regarding assessment of student knowledge, regarding grading of student knowledge. So from this slide, it is not meant that you read everything. We don't have time, but you can see that there is a lot of red text. This represents closing, reopening, based on the different grades, sometimes based on the region, which came much, much later than in Italy. So you can see almost the year 2020 and the 2021, we were opening, reopening. This was the situation in Slovenia. So actually the COVID affected, I would say, 2 school years, not only 1. Other empirical studies, I just put here example from Patrinos and the colleagues. They examined 35 studies from 20 countries. Italy was part of this out of two studies out of 35 from Invalsi data actually. There was one presentation, the first one you presented, but I think that the last presentation is also using those data, so I guess we will even learn more, and this is why I also gone there to discuss this. But what is the key issues that they were found was that most studies find evidences of learning loss. Learning loss was prior to COVID quite researched, but not in Europe. We don't have a lot of data specific about learning loss during the summer vacations when students are at home. Most of the data is from United States, but I found it quite similar, the results, as the results during the COVID epidemic and studies related to that. So the second point is that studies are consistently finding different levels of learning loss by student socioeconomic status, which are already mentioned, past academic learning, and subject of learning. Especially they were investigating math and language, or math and reading. This is the mostly investigated also during the when the research questions are related to summer learning classes. And the third common point, the longer the schools remain closed, the greater were the learning losses. And this, I would say, we share that in Slovenia. So, RED was not the first study which tried to capture the consequences of epidemic for the educational system in Slovenia, but I would say is the first one providing representative data, and this is, I think, this is why it is especially valuable. In 2019 to 2020, we did our national assessment did not take place, but they did it next year in school year 2020-2021 in May 2021. I think the situation in Italy was quite similar. But actually, you have your Invalsi data. We don't have the data that we could really compare. Compare in the meaning pre-COVID times and after COVID times. The challenges are, I would say, twofold. Comparability of results with previous years. not the same items are included, not the same generation, we don't have longitudinal studies. Small number of repeated items, sometimes it goes to 5, maybe 6, 4, 3, but not even in all tested subjects. National assessment, of course, are not for all subjects, school subjects. Compulsory is language of instruction, which is Slovene, but also on the border Italian and Hungarian. And mathematics for both grades, grade 6 and grade 9. Foreign language in grade 6. Or third subject chosen by the minister every single year for part of schools in grade 9. So I think we would agree, we should agree that this is really not something to be compared like trends in, let's say, for international large-scale assessments. As I said already, I'm using international variables, especially in the analysis, in the results, which I will present after that. International variables are especially background variables related to SES, related to gender and rural and urban location of the school, and especially I'm focusing on national variables. The first research question, which I was almost sure that Rolf will address, it was addressed by you, so I really can focus on the second one. And the second one is, what is the perception of 8th grade students and their teachers on the student academic performance and grading their knowledge during the school disruption caused by the COVID-19 epidemic in Slovenia. For the analysis, RALSA was used. I will not go into details. What is this? This is the system, the program for analyzing the international large-scale student assessments data as well as national. But the workshop is now somewhere around the corner, so I really will not speak more about that. Because it seems that you are more interested in the content and the results, not how to do it. First, the overall results on student opinion on their learning outcomes during the COVID-19 disruption. You can see, I bolded it, 73% of students, which is really majority of students, strongly disagree with the statement. But still, we have more than a quarter, almost 30%, they still believe, so it means agree or strongly agree, that they learned more at home than attending the regular classes at school. So let's see now if there are any differences based on the gender, based on SES, based on the school location. This was prepared because it is quite informative for me, because I can easily grasp the data when I see them and they're in colors and so on, but of course it is issue for interpreting them, and of course we did, for all of what we are presenting, we did a significance testing. So for this question, I learned more studying at home than when attending regular lessons at school. The relationship between two variables, student gender, boys, girls, and their agreement they learn more at home is statistically significant, and it's favoring boys. Boys, more boys think that they learn more during lessons at home. SES, we had to collapse two categories, which were low and medium SES, based on the very, very low number of the students that are characterized as low SES students, but also based on other factors, which I think are very relevant. So we did it comparison low, medium, and higher SES student group. So also those analyses were statistically significant, in this time favoring low and medium students, which actually we found this differs totally from the opinions of teachers and principals as well. Regarding school location, there was no statistically significant results found. But let's focus now on assessment, on grading student knowledge. So this what was our actual national edition. First, let's see about students' perception on assessment and grading during this disruption. I don't know if do you see, can you read it? Or? Yeah. Okay, great. It's smaller here actually. So those were the 5 added items. First one, for my grades, during the first wave of epidemic, I had to have the same good knowledge as I would have had if there had been no epidemic, so if there would be no schooling from home. You can see that majority of students, actually it's like 70%, agreed or strongly agreed. So that they have to have the same good knowledge for the same grades. But still, there is 1/3 of the students that they didn't agree with this statement. When assessing knowledge at a distance, teachers were able to ensure that students did not use unauthorized aid or any other aid in assessment. Majority of students agree or strongly agrees. The third one, my grades were statistically significantly influenced by how much my parents or guardians helped me. More than half of the population, 8th graders, agreed that this was effect on it had effect on the grades that they were receiving. The fourth one, today, reading it, I would never ever ask it because I think that students cannot actually answer it, but I have it in the questionnaire. The lessons were carried out well enough by the teachers during the distance education that I think it was right that they could also assess knowledge. So they were teaching us in the right way so they could assess the knowledge. I think this is not really not proper to ask students because it's really challenging how students would know how the instruction would look like and so on. I have a feeling that the teachers gave us higher grades than they would have otherwise if the schools had not been closed, and we see that more than half of the students agree. So they admit that they think, they feel they got higher grades than they would normally be graded. But let's see if there is any differences among the groups. So for the first one, for my grade during the first wave of the epidemic, I had to have the same good knowledge as I would have had if there had been no epidemic. Based on the SES students from low to medium SES families tends to agree more that they needed to have the same good knowledge if we compare them with the high SES students whose responses were more scattered across the response categories. You remember we had 4 different categories, and the relationship between those 2 variables was statistically significant. Based on the school location, there were no statistically significant differences. And teacher gave us higher grades than they would have otherwise if the school had not been closed. Based on the SES, students from higher SES families agreed more with the statement that they receive higher grades than normally they would get them. But in this case, the responses from the lower and medium SES families were more scattered across the categories. But still, a relationship between those 2 variables was statistically significant. I would say, I would try to interpret this. It seems that the COVID-19 disruption increased the grades inflation and inequalities. We saw higher SES students are more at the opinion that teachers gave them higher grades than lower SES students. Still, based on the school location, no statistically significant difference was shown. So let's see teachers about their perception on learning, knowledge, assessment, as well as grading. So teachers responded on the question. Majority of them, I think 81%, yeah, it is 81% of teachers disagreed or even strongly disagreed that their students have shown the same rate of learning growth as before the COVID-19. So This was also prior to that. It was obviously, I would say, everybody expected that and so on. So it goes in line with what we would assume. Students had not progressed to the extent that I would have normally expected at this time of year, and we see the opposite. Majority of the teachers agreed or strongly agreed with the item, with the statement that they think the students didn't progress as they would expect in any other situation. For this, we did analysis by the school subject. I was mentioning before that a lot of results, a lot of studies done based on the learning losses during the summer vacations was also checking different school subjects. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough data to really do subject by subject, because in the questionnaire I just listed all the subjects, all the compulsory subjects, the students had them. But here we had to collapse some categories. We did in 3 categories. One was sport, another one was social sciences and humanities, so subjects as language, citizenship, education, and so on, geography, and so on. And another category, combined category, was mathematics, technology, sciences, different sciences, like chemistry, physics, and so on. So what the results are showing, the teachers teaching social sciences or humanities are the ones who mostly disagree or at least strongly disagree with the statement that students have shown the same learning growth during the epidemic. Those were the same teachers that mostly found that their students' learning has substantially or to some degree decreased. So on the first glance, this is totally the opposite what the results from summer learning losses studies are showing, but still we combine the categories. Thank you. And during the remote schooling, teachers were instructed that they need to focus on the main, most important subjects, and we don't know actually on what they really focus, because most probably if you say to one teacher, focus on the most important subject, if you're teaching this subject, it is important to you, but we don't have those data. What about assessment and grading during the school disruption? So I would say 3 very interesting statements, items. Students' grades were significantly influenced by how much and what kind of help their parents, guardians offered them. Majority of teachers agreed, 81%. When assessing knowledge, I leaned toward higher grades because I wanted to avoid conflict situation and possible inspection procedure. We remember from the previous students already admitted, yeah, we feel we got higher grades than we would normally receive them, especially higher SES students. But here we see that around 50% of the teachers, they said, yeah, we were giving higher grades because we were afraid of inspection or any possible other conflict, which normally in the Slovenia daily base are actually this conflict factor are parents, which are going to school, calling the inspections, and so on. So half of the teachers admitted that they were giving higher grades. I assessed the demonstrated knowledge of students according to the same criteria as before the closures, the school closures. We see half and half, almost half and half this the distribution among. So teachers who tend to disagree more, they gave higher grades, agree more that they adhered to the same criteria as before the disruption. The association between different groups of subjects, of course, combined into 3 categories. School locations, which means rural or urban, were significant in all groups, defined by the categories of those variables. However, we still find, let's say, many cases where teachers tended to give higher grades, but at the same time they were claiming they were used the same criteria as before the disruption. So we found some contradicting results. I already mentioned that national data on grades in compulsory education, which in Slovenia is from grade 1 to grade 9, increased only in 1 year what we were seeing, comparing to what we were seeing prior in 10 years in the history. So for conclusion, I think we after COVID situation, after school closures, we saw the perception of teachers and also students about grades, about assessing their knowledge. I think we even have a bigger problem now. I don't know how to solve it, but it seems that grade inflation is even bigger. In some cases, it is similar to summer learning losses, especially when we are speaking about differences about SES. But I think that we would really like to rely, when comparing trends in student knowledge, on international large-scale assessment. So next year we will get data from PEARLS, which I think is really great. Reading literacy in grade 4, it's great for any other literacies. After that, in civic and citizenship education and so on. So in the future we would really like to rely on data from international large-scale assessment, comparing the trends, doing analysis based on the different groups of students and so on. Because I think the problem with grading student knowledge, this would mean that we need to start at the beginning, maybe to change the grading system and so on. I'm not sure if there will be a political backup to do something like that. So let's see, let's hope. Thank you.